welcome you here today to an event on a new report that we issued just a few weeks ago. It is this one, Bordering on Terrorism, Turkey's Syria Policy and the Rise of the Islamic State. I am one of the authors. Merve, to my right, is also one of the authors, and we have endeavored here to cobble together some information that has been in the public eye for some time, but perhaps not organized in any concerted fashion. The report was the first of FDD's new Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. We're very proud of that. And we are also very proud to welcome our distinguished panelists today. I want to very quickly introduce David Jackson, who will be our moderator today, and then he can in turn run the show. Before I do that, I just want to remind everybody, if you would please turn off your cell phones or set them to stun, including our panelists. We look forward to a free-flowing conversation once that is underway. David Jackson, to my far left, is a veteran journalist. He was the bureau chief for Time magazine. He has worked for the Defense Department. He has worked for Voice of America, the State Department. He was the executive editor at the Washington Times, and we are very pleased to have him here today to ask some probing questions of all of us. David, I turn it to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us. Turkey has historically been known as a crossroad of civilizations, a bridge between East and West. But in recent years, there's been growing concerns that Turkey has become a crossroad not of civilization, but of terrorist financing, arms, and fighters flowing across Turkey's southeastern border into the cauldron of conflict in Syria and Iraq. FDD's new report from the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finances raises a lot of important issues, and those issues are going to be the focus of our conversation this morning. The issues include the threat of terrorism, the role of NATO, Turkey's leadership and policies, and the ongoing plight of the Kurds, just to name a few. You will see brief bios of our panelists in the program, so I'll keep my introductions to them even briefer. Tony Badran, to my right, is a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, who has specialized in Lebanon, Syria, and Hezbollah. He was born and raised in Lebanon and has written extensively on Hezbollah. Jamie Detmer, next to him, is a journalist and broadcaster with the Daily Beast, as well as the Voice of America. Jamie has worked on every continent and has covered a range of stories as broad as his travels would imply, from U.S. politics to Ukraine. Dr. Jonathan Chanzer is Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He has worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury and is a research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dr. Chanzer is also a prolific author and, like his co-panelists, has contributed to a number of national and international publications. We're also fortunate to have his co-author of this report with us today, Merve Tahirlu. Merve, who was born and raised in Istanbul, brings both a personal and a scholarly perspective on the region that we will be focusing on. We'll start off by asking John to speak a few minutes about the report, and then we'll open the discussion to our panelists, and then halfway through this morning's meeting, we'll open to questions from the audience. So, John, can you start us off?
Sure. Thank you very much, David. The bottom line of our report is something that has been reported on by I think, many journalists at this point. And actually, they've drawn parallels on multiple occasions to the fact that Turkey has become the Peshawar of the new jihadi generation. That Turkey has become the transit point for fighters, for weapons, for cash, and for other material that a range of jihadi organizations have been using in their fight against not only the Syrian regime, but also against the Kurds and other factions in Syria and Iraq. This is, of course, deeply troubling. There are indications that the Turks may not have full control over this phenomenon. There is, of course, a 565-mile border on Turkey's southeast, bordering Syria, that would make it exceedingly difficult for the Turks to be able to monitor all of this activity. However, we have also seen reports of the Turkish border police and the military turning a blind eye, or perhaps even facilitating some of this activity. We continue to see the phenomenon of oil sales, even after ISIS has taken over territory along that border, that sales continue and that Turkey appears to be contributing to the financial windfall that ISIS has enjoyed. The question of why Turkey has done this, or why Turkey would be doing this, is something that I think continues to plague policymakers. And on the one hand, of course, Turkey is a NATO ally and a strong U.S. ally traditionally. But nevertheless, I think we have seen on the part of the AKP regime a determination to bring down the Assad regime amidst this very long and brutal civil war, and perhaps even to use these jihadi fighters not only to bring down Assad, but perhaps even to attack some of its Kurdish enemies inside the Syrian territory. These things are not at all clear. We have not gotten clarity from the AKP on this. In fact, there have been open disagreements between, for example, Vice President Biden and President Erdogan in Turkey. Of course, if everybody remembers, back in October, there was a somewhat open flap about this. And tensions remain. The tensions are such, in fact, today, that there are people who are openly questioning Turkey's place in NATO, that the Turks continue to look from the sidelines as ISIS continues its march across Syria, and the Turks have done very little to help. And in fact, they have refused to allow the U.S.-led coalition to take part in military activities from Turkish soil. So we will look into some of these issues today. I can tell you again that this is still very cloudy in terms of exactly what the Turks have deliberately done and what they have allowed to have taken place. And we will hopefully discuss some of that today. Merve, would you like to talk about some of the domestic aspects of this as well?
Yes, of course. Turkey's opposition has been highly critical of the AKP Syria policy for several reasons, but specifically with regards to ISIS, they have been very critical because they too share this idea that Ankara might have turned a blind eye to ISIS, and that in turn has allowed ISIS to establish a presence in Turkey, as we've detailed in our report, in places like Istanbul and Ankara, so not just even in the southeast bordering cities. Which is a big national security challenge for Turkey. But I guess the most important domestic challenge to the AKP, the political challenge, is the Kurdish question, where the AKP government has been engaged in peace talks with the PKK, Turkish Kurdish terrorist organization in Turkey. But what's been happening with ISIS in Syria, in the Kurdish territories there, which are controlled by the PYD, an offshoot of the PKK, has put these talks in a stalemate because the Turkish Kurds are very much seeing that that Ankara is turning a blind eye to ISIS, perhaps in part because they want ISIS to fight against the Kurdish population, the Kurdish groups that are in Syria right now, as a political gain, as leverage into use in these peace talks against the PKK, which is causing disenchantment in Turkey's Kurdish population against Ankara's sincerity in this reconciliation process.
Jamie, you were in the region just last month. How does this all look from the ground?
Sorry, is this on?
Yeah.
It's impossible really to have been covering the Syrian civil war for the last 3 years, or covering, for example, the siege of Kobani, without posing the question as a reporter, whose side is Turkey on? And I suppose the short answer will be it's on its own side. You opened your remarks by saying that traditionally Turkey's been seen as a bridge between the West and the East. I am not so sure. that is the vision that the current president of Turkey would endorse. I think he's looking more eastward and south and sees Turkey as a regional player, a major regional player, which can decide its own agenda, its own policy, its own interests, which aren't always coinciding with NATO. From a reporter's viewpoint, it's kind of very interesting being down on the border. I know the border from east to west, have travelled it frequently, have crossed it frequently into Syria. Jonathan's remarks were about it's hard to monitor that border. It is very, very noticeable down at the border that on the side, the Kurdish side closer to Iraq, that border is pretty well locked up. It is actually very, very hard to cross illegally. It's very hard to cross legally, of course, because they're not allowing people to cross at the moment. They open the gates sometimes. On the more Sunni side, it is very open. Now, the geography is slightly different. It's more craggy and mountainous on the western side. But if, for example, you go down to the border gate at Kilis, you have a main entry point which is monitored and controlled by the Turkish gendarmes and their customs and immigration service, but there's an illegal way in, which the buses take, right by the camp, and it is never, no one's interdicted there who's going backwards or forwards by the Turkish authorities. You can meet al-Nusra people, for example, with ease inside Turkey. The emir of al-Nusra for Azaz, a town on the border, has his family in Gaziantep and is frequently visiting. Jihadist fighters, whether they are for al-Nusra or ISIS, travel down on the Jihad Express by plane, by bus from Istanbul, and cross easily. So there aren't any real signs that the Turkish authorities are trying to close that down. For months, you've been able to see oil smuggling from the border, across the border. ISIS controls, what, about 60% of the oil fields in Syria. Only recently has there been some action by the Turkish authorities to try to close that smuggling down a bit. But you can still see trucks full of oil barrels going backwards and forwards. And the pipelines, there's some artificial pipelines that are being created, they're still functioning. So there are a number of questions to be raised about what the Turks think they are doing. I don't ascribe the idea that Turkey is, let's say, an agent of ISIS, but I do think that the current regime in Turkey sees ISIS as one of their agents or someone that they can control for various reasons. Merv mentioned that it could be useful to use ISIS against the Kurds, and I think that there was a very dramatic demonstration of their different attitude, the authorities in Ankara, towards the Kurds and ISIS, when of course they wouldn't join the US-led air coalition airstrikes on ISIS, but they did bomb, for the first time since 2012, Kurdish separatist fighters in southeast Turkey. I think there is also the viewpoint that ISIS and the jihadists are the ones who are most likely to topple Assad, and that is the key policy for Erdogan, to get rid of Assad. I think there's also the attitude and the fear that if Assad is toppled, then Ankara needs to have some kind of relationship with the jihadists who will have clout in a post-Assad world so that they can deal with them. So I think overall I see a Turkey which is no longer, as in the days of Turgut Özal, looking west, but are looking to become a power player in the region and don't feel that they have to follow or obliged to follow Western interests as much as they did, let's say, in 1990. I actually covered Ken Baker's visit to Turkey in 1990 when he visited with Turgut Özal to discuss Turkey's role in the fight against Saddam Hussein. And it was kind of interesting, of course. Baker dangled this idea that America would help Turkey gain entry into the European Union. I'm not too sure that that would work now. We had this week, after the roundup of journalists by the authorities in Turkey, a number of EU diplomats complaining about this. And then we had a speech from Erdogan saying that the EU should mind its own business. It isn't a remark that I think Özal would have made. So I think we're dealing with a changed Turkey.
Tony, how do you think Turkey sees this playing out? Who do they think is going to rule the post-Assad Syria? It's on.
Is it on? Okay. First, I apologize because I'm a little sick, so if my voice doesn't carry, I'm sorry. With regard to everything that's been discussed, the important thing in all of this is to really emphasize just a few notes to frame the conversation. On the one hand, the principal question is the question you posed, is that how is this integrated into Turkey's view of its Syria policy and its priorities in Syria? Now, when you look at the declared position of Turkey in Syria, establishing, let's say, a no-flight zone or a buffer zone or protecting civilians or toppling the Assad regime. Now, you can take any of these four elements and pick up the Washington Post and see an op-ed by Dennis Ross making the same claim, right? So it's not the strategy or the strategic principles in Syria that Turkey has are, for all the problems, are sound. Now, the context of this strategy has to also be put in the chronology of how the Syria policy in the United States also developed over the last few years. So before the rise of ISIS in 2012, when then Foreign Minister Davutoglu comes to Washington and talks to then Secretary of State Clinton, asking for a proactive American policy to help build up the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, to set up maybe some sort of a protected zone or some form of a no-fly zone. They were shot down. Comes then spring of 2013, a month after ISIS declares its birth in Syria in April. You have the chemical attacks that Assad perpetrates in Syria. There's then in the fall a discussion of whether to strike Assad. There's no strike of Assad. The FSA kind of collapses, right? So within that context, the ability of Turkish policy to actually pursue its objectives in Syria become much more constrained, right? And there's no doubt that for all the, there's a need to separate when Turkey talks rhetoric and what it actually can do. There's no question that the Turks want the United States to do the heavy lifting. There's no question that they want the United States to lead any effort, and there's in fact serious questions about the capabilities of the Turkish military to do any of the things that they say they want to do in Syria. But once we put all of that together, then you have a different picture in terms of what is achievable in Syria for Turkey, and why the border policy then we start looking at it differently. Because this is a border, it's important not to conflate. The picture, as Jonathan said, is very murky, but there's also an additional problem in how we talk about this when we conflate a lot of issues. All right, so Turkey's running guns across the border. Yes, it's running guns across the border. The United States and its allies are running guns across the border. That's the whole point. We want to run guns across the border to support the Syrian opposition. Now, the question is who these guns are going to. I'm not sure if you can actually pinpoint an incident where you can say there's a shipment intended for ISIS from the Turkish government. The Turkish government sends weapons. It has a whole bunch of proxies, a lot of whom, by the way, not designated, but the United States doesn't like. People like Ahrar al-Sham, for instance, other Islamist organizations that are operating under a Turkish umbrella, the Tawheed Brigade, for instance, which, by the way, the administration looked very favorably at in 2012 and early 2013. So there are areas of overlap and areas of disagreement that need to be kept in question, in mind. The other thing that happens also with this conflation is when you have various narratives. There's a big thing in the Syrian war overall, which is information warfare. So there's a lot of stakeholders and with various political agendas that they're pushing, whether in the domestic Turkish setting or in the Syrian setting as well, or the Kurdish and Iraqi setting as well. So for instance, when we say Turkey wants to fight the Kurds, well, Turkey is also supporting Barzani against ISIS in Iraq. So it depends, which Kurds are we talking about? When we're talking about the PKK franchise in Syria, and the idea, well, they didn't come to help the PKK franchise, let's not forget that 2 years ago these guys were fighting a war in Turkey. So again, the idea that somehow Turkey has to fall in line and not see its own strategic priorities addressed and sort of open a line to a group that it has been fighting in Syria also has to be kept in mind. So I think, and the same applies to the Turkish opposition in Syria as well, in Turkey as well. when we talk about their criticism of Turkish policy. Yes, but also keep in mind that a lot of the, the main Republican parties, People's Party's platform on Syria, when you boil it down, essentially becomes a pro-Assad position. So when you step back and look from the strategic interests of the United States as to what do we want to see in the end game in Syria, and that's what concerns me most. Other than the small, either the narrow counterterrorism focus or the narrow border control policy focus, or even domestic Turkish policies. When we as the United States are looking at this from, from the broader, from 30,000 feet up, we do not want a policy in which Assad survives in Syria. So the question is then, how can the United States step in and take a leadership role and then manage the obvious liabilities of the Turkish role, and manage it in a much more effective way to lead a coalition that can achieve mutual strategic interests that the United States to this day still professes as their own objectives in Syria, which is the end of the Assad regime.
Jonathan, your report looked at some of these questions. What's your view?
Well, look, I would say this, that Tony is right, that the strategic principles behind Turkey's Syria policy are sound. There's no question about it, that the Assad regime in Syria has been a dangerous regime. It has been a state sponsor of terrorism. It is responsible for the slaughter of untold numbers of people. I mean, the official death toll is 200,000, but it's likely double that. I think in the fog of war, we will find that there is a lot more going on beyond just the barrel bombs and the occasional chemical weapons attack. And so the idea that Assad must go, I think it's fair to say that the Turks are right about this. I think the problem is that the way that they have gone about this is unsound. In other words, I understand that they've been unhappy with the United States. Obviously, our inability to enforce our own red lines after the Ghouta attack. I was in Turkey when that happened, and they were incredulous. They were in complete disbelief that the United States would fail to enforce this red line, and felt as if they were abandoned. But I will say this, that as much as U.S. policy has been feckless, the Turkish policy has been reckless. And this is a key point, that they have gone far beyond what is acceptable as a U.S. ally. They have contributed significantly to a counterterrorism problem. I would go as far as to say that if we were able to lock down that 565-mile border, we would not have the ISIS problem that we have today. That Turkey serves as a rear guard for ISIS and for Nusra and for a broad range of other bad actors that we would seek to curb. And so we need to figure out here in this country how to walk and chew gum. We need to figure out how to curb the Assad regime and to weaken it significantly, while also working with the Turks to ensure that they do not allow for ISIS to grow and become more dangerous than it is today. I mean, the bottom line here is that the Turks don't truly care who goes in, what kinds of weapons go in, where the weapons are going, and they've made this actually very clear. When Merve and I did our research for this report, we spoke to some U.S. government officials who told us that the conversations between senior U.S. officials and Turkish officials indicated to them, where, I mean, the Turks told them outright that they knew that this was a problem. They knew that the jihadis were going in. They knew that the weapons were going, in some cases, to the wrong people. And they said, look, we'll fix this once Assad falls. We know how to do this. We're a strong military. We've got a strong intelligence apparatus. We can pull this together after we achieve our objective. But in the meantime, when you look at what's happening in the region, the jihadi problem has become far more complex. We're seeing ISIS grow to strengths that we, I think, previously could not have imagined. We're seeing war crimes, beheadings, sex slaves. I mean, these are things that we cannot abide by. And so there is a sense now that the U.S. must go in and do something with the Turks. And again, I should just note that we are having a very hard time with this because of the traditional Turkish position here in the United States, that they are still seen. And you hear the State Department spokesman, I mean, just even 2 days ago, they continue to reinforce that Turkey is a wonderful democracy and a wonderful ally of the United States and crucial to our operations abroad. and that only tells part of the story. We need to go in, we need to make sure that that border is closed up, that we have a better sense of what's going in and out, and we need to be more assertive with our Turkish allies, because if we do not, the problem will exacerbate further, and it will create strains between the U.S.-Turkish relationship without question, but also could create an ISIS problem that we can't fix.
Jamie, let me ask you something real quick, and then you can respond to that too. With all these IS terrorists coming across the border, this is obviously, there's a lot of dangerous people there, particularly for journalists who are trying to tell the story of what's going on. How good is our information coming to that region? Are journalists able to cross back and forth as easily as they were before? Do we have good intelligence coming from that region now?
No, I mean, we can't cross back and forth easily now. I went into Syria about half a dozen times in the last 3 years, always very dangerous. It has become a lot more dangerous, obviously, since the beheadings, murder, James Foley and Steve Sotloff. We're all being even more careful. I was trying to negotiate a way in. I haven't been inside Syria now for 6, 7, 8 months, and I'm very frustrated by it. I could go to the northeast where I've been before with the Kurds, but I wanted to go over towards Idlib and Aleppo provinces. Before, I would not embed with anyone. I would just, move around freely, have my own translator, have my own driver, both of which I trusted greatly with my life. But now you have to embed, and I've been trying to negotiate a way in with various brigades. Some brigades have offered to take me in. I've decided not to go in with them because then I subsequently found out ISIS was holding some of the relatives as hostages of brigade commanders, so immediately a journalist can be currency in brokering a deal on that. We can move freely, and I ought to add that since the major al-Nusra push in Idlib province, it has become even harder. I did try to negotiate a safe passage with al-Nusra a few weeks ago and got a blank no from them. And Idlib at that time was Hazan Brigade, which is a pro-Western brigade, had a lot of control. Now they don't. So we're basically seeing in both Aleppo and Idlib province it being very dangerous for Western journalists to cross. So we're all being a lot more cautious. It is, of course, we can freely move along the border on the Turkish side, although there are some risks there. Some criminal gangs have been involved in trying to kidnap 2 photojournalists quite close to the border in Ufa. It looked like they had a deal with ISIS to do this, but it might have been a freelance operation by them, thinking that they could sell the Western journalists over to ISIS. It's getting a little bit more dangerous. In some of the remote villages, you have to be a little bit careful now, particularly, I ought to add, there is some sympathy amongst the rural population, the non-Kurdish rural population, towards ISIS and the jihadists down there, including officials from the AKP also being kind of pro-jihadist, saying that their agenda is not so different from ours. And this is something I wanted to ask Jonathan and Merv about. We've talked about their different agendas and their different interests, and it's partly our own fault that we haven't been clear about what our policies are, and we have downgraded the toppling of Assad in the latest strategy, therefore forcing the Turks to have to come up with some of their own policy positions. But we haven't talked about the rhetoric of the Turkish president in recent weeks. I mean, there have been a bizarre series of very anti-Western speeches, laden with disdain for Washington and London, with a very strong Islamist narrative. And in tweet form, you can see an affinity between some of the things the Turkish president is saying, and ISIS even. I remind you of the speech about Lawrence of Arabia being a greater threat to Turkey than ISIS, or certainly his modern-day Western heirs. And in that speech, of course, he talked about Sykes-Picot a lot. This is something that ISIS talk about a great deal. If you recall, they made the great photo opportunity of bulldozing a berm on the Syrian-Iraq border to show this was the end of Sykes-Picot. So, I sometimes believe that you have to believe what people are saying. That if they continually say something that, we're about Islam and we don't like the West, or we're disdainful of the West, then maybe you should take that at face value. And I'm interested in what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Well, look, I would just say this, that first of all, the rhetoric has been, beyond the pale. But it's even, what I would say is what's even more disconcerting right now is the fact that ISIS is only part of the Islamist jihadist problem that we've observed in Turkey. I mean, for example, we've identified here at FDD over the last several years that there are no less than 14 senior Hamas operatives that are based in Turkey right now. That the man who claimed credit for the kidnapping and killing of those 3 teens this summer in the West Bank is based in Turkey. His name is Salah Harouri, and he is the founder of the Izzedine al-Qassam Brigades, Hamas's armed wing for the West Bank. One of the founders of Hamas, Imad al-Alami, we just learned, is just went to Turkey for some medical assistance, and he is now remaining there today. He's designated by the U.S. Treasury dating back to 2003, and he's one of the original militants from Hamas. And Turkey has rolled out the red carpet for Hamas. And this should be deeply disconcerting for anyone who's watching the activities of this NATO ally. And if that were not enough, we've also been able to, I think, accrue a lot of information over the last several years of the fact that Turkey has helped Iran evade sanctions to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. There was the gas for gold scheme that yielded Turkey about $15 billion that we're able to track. That was between 2012 and 2013, right at the height of that of the Iran sanctions regime. And also, if anyone was watching the corruption scandal that has erupted over the last year, we actually just celebrated the first anniversary of the corruption scandal on the 17th. But in that report, it was a 300-page report that poor Merve had to translate for us. Well, we found 30 pages worth of information demonstrating that the Turks had been helping Iran evade sanctions even further, possibly to the tune of $100 billion. And so what we are seeing kind of more broadly right now, oh, and I should also just add that on top of that, Turkey's been out of compliance with terror finance norms, according to the Financial Action Task Force, which is kind of the UN of terrorism finance. They've been out of compliance for more than 7 years. And so when you take all of this in, you get a sense right now that it's not just the rhetoric, it's not just the permissive and lax border policies that we're seeing on the Syrian border that have helped to benefit ISIS, but we're also seeing a range of other illicit activity that is benefiting radicals and jihadists in the region, and it raises very troubling questions about the trajectory of Turkey under the AKP.
Let's talk about NATO for a minute. Turkey's a NATO member. The members of NATO are bound together by shared values, shared defense interests, and clearly one of the biggest threats to NATO members is the threat of terrorism. And here we have arguably one member of NATO who could be said to be working with terrorists. Now, Turkey would say, well, we're working with them, but we know how to control them. Let's talk a little bit about the debate inside among NATO members about what do you do with a situation like this, and if NATO were to get tough with Turkey and hold it to account for changing its behavior, what are the consequences of that?
Maybe I'll take it initially. I mean, I've talked with NATO officials and European officials in Turkey who are very frustrated about what's happening. I mean, one European intelligence officer was saying to me when I was asking about illicit finance and Turkish banks, he was saying, where do you think the ransom money is being lodged? You know, there's a flow through of money through these Turkish banks. There's very little that's going on from the Turkish authorities to stop it, or even any warnings to the banks to be careful and know your customer. For example, policies in the UK and the US. There is no mechanism, of course, to throw anyone out of NATO, from my understanding. I mean, it's a club, and I suppose if you're asked not to come, you won't come. But I mean, there is no mechanism actually to eject someone. I mean, I was listening to John McLaughlin, the former CIA director, a week ago at the Jamestown Foundation Terrorism Conference. And he was saying that you don't get everything you want from Turkey, but you can normally get something. But again, I come back to that issue of is this a very changed Turkey? That before you could dangle the EU membership in front of them, Now, obviously, I think you can't, and it isn't just what Erdogan said this week about mind your own business to EU diplomats. 6 months ago, I wrote an article about his chief advisor saying they're not actually very interested in joining the European Union anymore. And no one took that very seriously, but it's kind of interesting that they've not been pushing entry negotiations recently. So it may be that if there was more leadership from the West about inconsistency in leadership, about what the policy, what the strategy is to end the war in Syria, overcome the problems generally in the Levant, that might be helpful. We have been very inconsistent in our positions, and sometimes we decided we haven't want to do anything and we'll leave it up to the Qataris or the Saudis to take a lead on this. Then we get involved. So I have a certain amount of sympathy when Turkish politicians will say to me, look, you know, they're going to do exactly what they did before. They're going to leave us with the mess afterwards, because after this is all over, they go off and the impact is on us. But I do think that we are looking, and I have to repeat this, at a very changed Turkey. I mean, even if I've known Turkey 20, 30 years, it is a remarkably different country from now to when it was. You know, we're now seeing them talk about turning the schools to teaching, you know, Ottoman Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, with Arabic script, etc. And I think that maybe we are behind the lag on this, that we're still thinking this is the Turkey of Turgut Özal and others, and it isn't.
Right. Jonathan?
Well, no, I wanted to just say also that while we've looked into this question of whether Turkey still belongs in NATO, but I do think that, and maybe Tony has some thoughts on this, I mean, you also have to wonder whether NATO has fallen down on the job in terms of perhaps even intervening in places like Syria or in the Ukraine. There are questions about this, right, about whether they're doing their job in the first place, and that might be turning Turkey off. Nevertheless, I do think that when you look at that range of activity that I mentioned between ISIS and Hamas and everything else, that it does raise questions about whether they do belong there when we talk about the values of NATO.
Right. Tony, I wanted to ask you to address that in a second. First, I also want to quote, the report quotes a Turkish official as saying, we know how to deal with these extremist groups. My question is, do they? How would they deal with them?
You want me to start with that, or the...
Whatever you like.
Okay. Well, just quickly about the NATO thing. I mean, yeah, I mean, the relation, it's mutually bad, right? So but this is, again, a symptom of what I was talking about, the broader context of how the Syria policy had sort of played out, which is, you know, there was a Turkish jet that was shot down by the Syrians. The Syrians attacked Turkish villages, sent car bombs to border crossings, you know, kidnapping and sabotage inside Turkey as well. The Turks, there was talk about the Turks invoking Article 5 in order to get a NATO response. The White House very much discouraged any such talk because they saw this as a slippery slope towards intervention in Syria. So they left the Turks hanging, which incidentally is also relevant to the idea of Turkish intervention against ISIS, because there is a real fear, and it's not unsubstantiated, that, okay, let's say we do something, assuming they can do anything, right, in terms of military power, in terms of that. Are we going to be left hanging with no other broader you know, scope for where this policy is going to go with U.S. leadership towards broader goals in Syria beyond ISIS, the ISIS question? And so to your other question about whether they can control them, look, there's very clear, it's very clear that the Turks have vastly overestimated their capabilities. And if the Syria fiasco has showed something, it's that there's like severe limits as to what Turkey can do. And there was a hype before that, incidentally very much encouraged by the White House, about Turkish sort of soft power and influence and all of that, which exists, but you know, it was blown out way out of proportion. And so, and the military capability as well, and their intelligence capabilities. So, can they govern ISIS or handle ISIS? Look, ISIS is not a transient, you know, floating phenomenon. It's a very much an Iraqi phenomenon. Everything else is in addition to that. All the foreign fighters and all that. That's an addendum. At the heart of it, ISIS is an Iraqi phenomenon that feeds on Sunni resentment towards Iranian domination in Iraq, And the same thing in Syria with their ally, the Bashar al-Assad regime. It's a tribal Ba'athist conglomerate mixed with this kind of weird jihadism, the remnants of AKI and the Islamic State, and the Islamic State of Iraq, and so on. So this is why I would actually qualify one thing that Jonathan said earlier about, if we had locked the Turkish border, we wouldn't have the same kind of ISIS problem that we had today, to a certain extent. But the ISIS phenomenon is entirely independent of Turkey. It's a tribal Iraqi/Syrian issue at heart, with the jihadi thing kind of on top. There was a quote from a Turkish official in 2012 or late 2011, probably 2012, in an ICG, International Crisis Group report, when Nusra was merely a couple of thousand fighters. And they did say, look, we understand these guys are here. We don't think they're going to be a big problem. They're tiny. If you just move in, we have the ability to build up another counter force from local Syrian rebels that are not this type. They're not jihadist or Salafist in orientation, and we can contain this problem. Now, in part, this reflects breathtaking naivete in terms of reading American policy on the one hand and reading their own capability on the other hand. But it also reflects, in some measure, some truth. Because had you been able to build a third counterforce, as the Turks had been, and not just the Turks, incidentally, this is not just a Turkish position. This is a broad allied position from France all the way to Saudi Arabia. You have to build a counterforce. Oh, including several top senior cabinet members of both administrations, all of whom have been sacked, incidentally, or left the administration. That you have to build a third force in Syria. Now, it's become much more complicated, obviously. But back then, in 2012, that statement in and of itself was not entirely fanciful, even though it was, incredibly naive.
We're going to invite questions just in a couple of minutes, so start thinking of good questions. Let me ask about U.S. policy. What is U.S. policy in the region? How is it perceived in the region? And what can the U.S. do at this point?
U.S. policy in the region is a shambles. I think at this point that's very clear, that I think we had opportunities early on to devise a strategy that could help bring down the regime of Bashar al-Assad and perhaps temper some of the very nasty fighting that we have seen in Syria. We could have certainly prevented it, I think, from spreading into Iraq the way that it has. I think that we have, obviously, in our decision not to enforce our own red lines, we have lost the faith of a lot of allies, and I don't just mean the Turks, I mean the Saudis and a lot of the other Gulf countries. And look, not all of them are wonderful allies. I like to describe the Qataris and the Turks and the Saudis as not quite friends, maybe not quite enemies, more along the lines of frenemies. And that, but nevertheless, I think they are now looking elsewhere. They're devising their own policies. They are willfully challenging the United States based on the fact that they have lost confidence in our foreign policy in the region. I think the Turks are very much an example of that. The Qataris, to be sure, the Kuwaitis, the Saudis, I mean, they're all going their own way right now. And so that really, I think, is at the heart of the problem, is that we really need to get a handle on all of these issues again. I think that there was a sense that we were getting ready to pivot to Asia or to rebalance our portfolio, and that we just didn't want to have any role in all of this, or that perhaps we just didn't want to get involved in another fight against another jihadi organization. There was the famous quip by the president that ISIS represented something akin to a JV team trying to wear a Kobe Bryant jersey. And so I think there's even been a deliberate attempt to define down the threat. And that has not resonated well in the region among our Sunni allies, particularly as the death toll has mounted in Syria. And so I still believe to this day that nothing can replace U.S. leadership, that even though I think we have failed up until now with these problems, I still believe that a clear U.S. policy and a new plan of action could begin to temper some of these problems.
But the policy is clear. It just is rather unworkable, as I understand the policy at the moment. It is degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS. and to engineer some kind of political deal in Syria, possibly with Assad now staying temporarily. That is, from my understanding, what the policy is. I mean, the question, does it work? I mean, I agree with you completely. What I've heard constantly from Syrian rebel commanders and Syrian fighters is, and Syrian refugees for that matter, is remembering the red line about chemical weapons, nothing done, and they just do not believe the United States anymore. It lacks credibility. Nature abhors a vacuum. What we are seeing increasingly is Syrian rebel fighters defecting from even brigades that we're backing to join ISIS and al-Nusra because they don't trust where the United States is going on this, and they are absolutely appalled that we seem to be downgrading the toppling of Assad as a policy. You know, a third force is going to be extremely hard to build in those circumstances.
Okay, Jonathan, do you want to add to that?
Well, and I think Tony will want to say something about this too. And I think, you know, part of the elephant in the room behind all of this is not just that we haven't decided to take out Assad, but that we're also flirting with Iran as a potential partner in the region, and that I think a great deal of our decision not to go in to topple Assad is based on this ongoing nuclear negotiation with the Iranians, and that this would be a red line for them, and therefore we can't do anything that might cross their lines. And so then you start to look at the entire Sunni matrix right now, from the Saudis to the Qataris to the Turks, etc., and they are deeply concerned that we are about to hand Iran the keys to hegemony in the region, and it is that underscores all of this. And so it all fits together. It's all incredibly complex, but I do think at the end of the day we are looking at a failure overall of U.S. policy if we want to try to combat some of these phenomena.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. Would you please identify yourself and then keep your questions brief, please? Yes, sir.
Thank you. The broader view is that really it's not just Turkey, but Turkey and Iran are in cahoots of dividing the Middle East between them, the old Ottoman Empire. For this, you need to destabilize the entire region. And ISIS, Assad, various other groups, the more they fight with each other, the more the ripe apple is going to fall into those two hands. The key example of this cooperation between Turkey and Iran is, of course, the gold deal for breaking the sanctions. They are working together. They are not working against each other. There is oil in the north, there is oil in the south, and at the end of the day, each one is going to redivide the old Ottoman Empire. I'd like to have some comments.
I'll just start. I disagree that there's a cooperation going on between. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. I think it's a fundamental competition between them in Syria and in Iraq as well. And it's played out. It's been playing out very obviously for a few years in Iraq and within the Kurdish scene in Iraq in particular. There's the balance of sort of the pro-Turkish Barzani versus the pro-Iranian Talabani and others. And in fact, there was accusations even that the Iranians were using some of the PKK back when they were fighting in 2012 to actually undercut Turkey. So there's very much a rivalry going on, and that's really another issue we didn't really get to touch on that much, which is the idea of the fantasy of the zero problems policy, right? Because it's predicated precisely on the idea of sort of Islamic comity or pan-Islamic comity that and slash business interest that would override geostrategic rivalries that are structural and systemic in the region for decades and centuries. So I think Syria kind of was a moment of clarity in that it showed that this is all nonsense. Okay, there are strategic interests and they are opposed. And so you can talk about the gold trade. I mean, we can also talk about whether the White House actually very much wanted it as a sweetener to the Iranians, so they looked the other way in order for that to happen. But leaving that aside, if you look on the ground in terms of how Turkish assets versus Iranian assets are playing out in Iraq and in Syria, they're fundamentally at odds with each other. And that's where, again, going back to the broader geopolitical balance and the US strategy in the region, traditionally, had we not sort of gone on this adventure of hugging the Iranians now, the United States, and this is what everybody expected, you have a golden opportunity, the linchpin of the Iranian alliance in the Mediterranean, the Assad regime, is on its back foot. Where's the United States to undercut it, lead an alliance, manage it, and protect common interests as it always does, roll back the Iranian interest for the pro-American status quo conservative state side. And that didn't happen. Now, when that doesn't happen, it's not only that the two peripheral states are fighting, it's that the United States is sitting on the sideline. The United States is effectively on one side against the other. So effectively, the United States has tilted for the Iranian side in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, not towards the Saudi, Qatari, or traditional Sunni side in the region. And that's a fundamental issue. It's not that we were sitting passively. We were actively supporting one side against the other. And that is where everything starts going haywire, because then everybody starts to reach to what they can do. And what they can do is either incompetent or nasty, one or the other. On top of the good, to not be unfair, I mean, let's not forget, Turkey is hosting 1 million+ refugees. Without them, these people would be destitute, if not dead. They're the ones without which the moderate opposition and any kind of opposition in Syria would be essentially choked off. And that's why there's a disingenuous aspect to people when they say, shut down the border, or even within the Turkish opposition, you have to have a different, policy and whatever. I mean, what you're saying effectively is you're going to choke off the Syrian revolution, because you're shutting down a fundamental artery for it to be able to sustain itself. So just sort of to keep that in mind. So and the fact that the Turks, despite all this pressure, continue to do it just only underscores how much this is a national security strategic interest for them. They have to have in Syria, they cannot have the Assad regime in Syria. They cannot have Iran win out in Syria.
I would just add this, that I have heard this argument that the Turks and the Iranians are looking to divide up the Middle East and enjoy the spoils. I would actually say that at one point it might have looked that way. 2012, 2013, as we began to understand the depths of the gas for gold scheme, that it was significant, there was a huge amount of money changing hands. My assessment now is a little bit different. My assessment now is that the Turks likely believed that they could bring down Assad and help Iran circumvent sanctions and reap a windfall and do it all at once. I mean, they sort of thought this was going to, this was going to be, this was going to be a John Grisham ending for the Turks, that they would just kind of get everything that they wanted at the end, and they really believed that it was only a matter of time before Assad would fall, right? That a year into the revolution there, that Assad was beginning to waver, and that it looked like the fact that the Turks were allowing these fighters to go in and the weapons to go in, that the knees of the Syrian regime were beginning to wobble. And so why not benefit as well from sanctions? And Tony's right. There was a moment there where the United States learned about the sanctions busting, the gas for gold scheme, and allowed it to continue for another 6 months, raising questions about whether the United States was allowing this as sort of unofficial sanctions relief to the Iranians before sanctions relief became cool. Okay? And so there are a lot of questions that were being raised, but if you look now, I would argue that the Iranian-Turkish relationship is very much on the rocks. You just had the foreign minister to go visit Iran the other day. They disagreed very publicly about the Syrian civil war. They've been in arguments about the price of gas that's coming from Iran into Turkey. You get a sense that this relationship is now fraying significantly now that the Turkish plan to bring down Assad regime quickly has failed.
Thank you. We've got another question.
Thank you very much. My name is Terrorism. I'm actually the U.S. representative for CHP, the main opposition party from Turkey, so I would like to clarify an issue or two. I know that there's a perception that Tony shared that we have pro-Assad policy. 2 years ago, to be specific, on October 22nd, 2012, our party went on public. Actually, our chairman, he wrote an op-ed for Wall Street Journal. I don't know how much more public you can get other than writing an op-ed in Wall Street Journal, but we said that Assad should go, and that he's a dictator and he's an oppressive regime, but they should be through a negotiated process that's going to involve all the different stakeholders. And we also pointed out that having a vacuum through a military intervention in Syria would create such chaos that will be filled by jihadist radicals. I mean, 2 years later, I know it sounds really annoying to say we were right, but I mean, if you look at what's become for Syria, we have a huge problem with the radical Islamic fighters. And for my job, I go to Turkey once a month, so I travel quite a bit in the country. I understand that you say the border is long and it's not 100% easy to control it. But what about the recruitment centers? What about the recruitment centers in Istanbul, in Ankara? There's a gift shop in Istanbul that sells pro-ISIS stuff. I mean, there are massive, celebrations. There are massive prayers for ISIS. I mean, what's the excuse that the AK people give when it comes to this? So I think that saying that the government is turning a blind eye is rather optimistic, not realistic.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I mean, I agree with you that it's not just a turning of a blind eye. At best, it's a turning of the blind eye. But we've surely seen some facilitation as well. I mean, just in the last few weeks, it's sometimes very hard for wounded Kurdish fighters, for example, to get across the border from Kobani. They're sometimes left there for 6, 7, 8 hours at the entry point. It's not just the Kurds who are claiming this. Turkish ambulance drivers who are telling me the same thing. But then jihadist fighters have no trouble. Wounded jihadist fighters are having no trouble crossing the borders and getting into the private hospitals along the border either. There's no interdiction there. As you well know, there is this very interesting case, about a year ago, you probably be able to remember the dates better than me, when we had this very strange convoy with weapons in, being protected by Turkish intelligence people, and then the prosecutors who try to look into this get moved from their jobs. So we have a wealth of detail of jihadist activity along the border, as you point out, in Istanbul. This could be controlled more. I mean, the current Prime Minister, when he was Foreign Minister, would always say, how can we stop everyone at the airport who's got a beard? But we're looking at, according to European and US intelligence sources, about 1,000 still, 1,500 foreign fighters a month going in. Jihadi brides have no trouble going in. Recently, a French TV crew got one of their numbers to, I suppose, farm herself out to be a jihadi bride on Facebook, and they arranged the whole deal with a jihadist fighter, and they followed all the way through, virtually just up until the border, where she was meant to meet her new husband in Urfa, and then they were just going to drive across. So yes, I mean, this border could be controlled a lot more, and it could be controlled, I believe, and still allow weapons to go into favoured brigades and kept away from immediately going into al-Nusra or ISIS hands. So it does raise very significant questions. Of course it does.
I would just echo that very briefly, just to say throughout our report, we make it very clear that in some cases it looks like willful blindness on the part of the border guards and others, and in some cases we are deeply concerned that it looks like there is Turkish complicity. And the question is, what is the official policy? And that's where I think it's more murky. That's where we have a harder time trying to get at exactly what's going on. Again, the AKP continues to acknowledge that they understand that there's a problem. They continue to say that they're doing something about it, and then we continue to see the problem fester. And so are they doing this on purpose? Do they not have the capacity to fix this? I think they do have it. And this is what raises such troubling concerns for us right now. One other quick note, and you mentioned how your party has been vilified for saying that you're pro-Assad. And Tony mentioned this early on, that there's a lot of disinformation out there. There are a lot of people who are being pilloried for making one comment or another. Turkey is one of these environments right now, and we try to be very careful in this report about which sources to cite, because every time you cite a Kurdish source, or they're going to say, aha, that's disinformation. Every time you quote the CHP as a source, aha, well they're secular, they're automatically anti-AKP. You cite a Gulenist source, and they're going to say, well, of course that's disinformation, it's a lie. The problem is that when you begin to see the totality of the information, and it's going to come from US government officials and from all the other sources that I mentioned, it becomes impossible to ignore. And that is why we wrote this, right? And so it's not just you that is under fire for certain policies. Everybody is being vilified by the regime for reporting on this. And this is another aspect of the problem, and that is that the regime will, I mean, they continue to prosecute those who would even dare to report on this phenomenon. And again, that gives a sense that perhaps there's a larger force at play, a more troubling policy at play.
Just very quickly in this, the PYD Kurdish group, they too were allowing jihadists to cross from their areas, coming from Iraq through the Kurdish northeast to go west to Idlib and Aleppo. Okay, so they let them because they weren't fighting them at the time; they were going to fight Assad. So the PYD is complicit just as much in this kind of traffic of fighters coming in from everywhere. And now they turn around when it's against them. Now they turn around and accuse Turkey of it. So this is when you say there's information operation, because these people are all political, right? Everybody has a political thing. This is not to say that the information, is completely false or half false or whatever. You have to kind of weed through very carefully the sources as any good researcher would do. But with regard to one last note to the CHP position, who was it, Merve, that wrote recently in the Hürriyet a op-ed representing the CHP about a sort of foreign policy principles, secular foreign policy principles or whatever. Some recent op-ed by one major, I forgot, his name escapes me now. And two things that he said, and this is how you find, behind the rhetoric, it's de facto a pro-Assad policy, because he says, A, Turkey should stop calling for Assad to leave. B, Turkey should stop supporting assets in Syria. Well, when you put these two together, I mean, you can say whatever you want about Assad being a dictator. Boils down to that the CHP is deeply uncomfortable with this. They view it as a sectarian policy, and they're not behind it. You can say we want a negotiated settlement. That's great. Assad says he wants a negotiated settlement too. On whose terms? On what terms do you have a negotiated settlement? So, not to get into the mud of domestic Turkish politics, but it's kind of worth keeping that context in mind.
Thank you. We've got a question on the aisle.
My name is Connie Zulama. I'm with the American Kurdish Information Network. 2 months ago, the nominee to be the United States Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, gave a talk at the Carnegie. He talked about the three famous Ds: disrupt, degrade, destroy. He was referring to ISIL. And he added, no longer to be a threat to Syria and Iraq. Is it in America's interest to keep Syria and Iraq intact? President Obama loves to talk about being on the right side of history. What is the right side of history? Can Yugoslavia be the model for Syria and Iraq?
Thank you. Good question, panel.
Well, the policy in the West has been wedded to having the Sykes-Picot borders. I mean, one doesn't, I suppose, have to be sympathetic to ISIS or even in agreement with the Turkish president to suggest that maybe this idea that we can somehow keep these states as one, I suspect is impossible now. I don't know how Syria remains one state after all of this. The Kurds certainly want their statelet in the north. I've often asked this question just of ordinary Syrians. Could you sit down and have as your neighbour an Alawite, for example, in, let's say, in Homs or some of the suburbs of Homs or Hama, where there were some terrible massacres, and they say, no, I can never have them as neighbours again. I just think on a visceral level, on a human level, I don't see how this is possible now, in Syria at least.
All right. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Audrey Williams. I'm from Partnership for Secure America, and I want to thank all of you for this very interesting discussion today. My question goes towards kind of a running theme throughout this discussion, which is kind of, why would Turkey want to, at best, turn a blind eye to groups like ISIS, at worst, potentially facilitate groups like ISIS? And I was wondering if, specifically in any of the research that you, Dr. Shanzer and Tahirolu did, but also all of the other panelists, if you could comment on, whether looking at the history of Turkish engagement and the Turkish state's engagement and military apparatus's engagement with extremist groups, how helpful that might be, because I know, we all know this is not Turkey's first round of dealing with extremists. I mean, for decades it has been dealing with the PKK. There have been other extremist groups, especially within that within that challenge, especially the kind of dynamics between Kurdish Hezbollah and the PKK. So I was wondering if, looking into that history, if that might be helpful at all, or what kind of commentary the panelists could give on the history of the Turkish state and military apparatus engaging with these extremist groups, and also engaging with the southeast region, which even before this was kind of, you know, a place of smuggling. I've heard that there have been places called smugglers' bazaars, that it has been kind of almost a family tradition in some of these areas, particularly because for a long time it was not really tied into the Turkish economy. So I was wondering if there could be any comments on that. Thank you.
Sure. Maybe I'll take the first crack at some of this. First of all, I do believe that the Turkish position has been extremely hypocritical, given its long fight with the PKK, given its approach to terrorism regionally, the fact that they've allowed even tacitly for some of this activity to take place. You know, if it was the PKK that was the target, of course you would be hearing howls of protest from Turkey on a regular basis. And here they're saying, I mean, look, even with the designation of the Nusra Front, I mean, Turkey was incredibly ambivalent about even its designation. They acknowledged the ties to Al-Qaeda, but still thought it was a bad idea for political reasons. And this is, I mean, it just doesn't square with their past approach to fighting terrorism. On the question of smuggling, yes, these are long-standing routes. Many of them, I think, have been upgraded in recent months. You know, we've read a number of reports, and I think, Jamie, you've seen some of these smuggling apparati where, I mean, they have really gotten it down to a science in terms of how they pour oil into these pipelines, and they cross the border end to the other side, and then they're able to be smuggled. I think, again, with a wink and a nod in some cases from the AKP government. The kind of the broader comment that I would make, and this is something that we looked at, I think, very closely in our report, is that you have to recall that the AKP at its core is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. And even before the outbreak of the war in Syria, they were courting the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, trying to rehabilitate it after decades of having been beaten down by the Assad regime. And after the Arab Spring erupted, there was a sense among the Turks that they could try to rehabilitate the Brotherhood further. And then certainly when the war erupted in Syria, there was a sense that perhaps the Brotherhood could become the cornerstone of a new regime that would be essentially a proxy for the AKP in Syria. They believed that they could help guide the outcome. And it looked almost inevitable from the Turkish perspective that they had the rise of the Brotherhood in Egypt, they had the rise of the Brotherhood in Tunisia, and this was going to be what was going to happen in Syria as well. And that's what they began to push for. Now, as the war dragged on, it became far more complicated. And my sense is, and I think Merve and I agreed on this while we were writing it, but my sense is that when each effort failed, they doubled down yet again. I mean, this is like a very bad gambler at a casino. That every time they put money down and they lost, they would put it right back up again on the same bet. And they kept losing. They could not bring down the regime. And so every time they made another effort, the actors became more radical. And so you saw the rise of the Nusra Front and Nahrar al-Sham and then eventually ISIS. And it became something that was sort of a de facto policy. I don't think that the Turks, my personal opinion is, I don't believe that the Turks at the AKP decided right up front, we're going to support ISIS. I think it was a deteriorating policy that ultimately they came to embrace because they can't see any other way forward. And so I think to a certain extent that explains what we're seeing today.
But Audrey's question also goes back almost to pre-Erdogan days. And it's very interesting you mentioned Kurdish Hezbollah. In these recent Kurdish protests and riots in the wake of Kobani, or during Kobani, of course, we suddenly saw Kurdish Hezbollah reappear, which had been virtually created by Turkish military intelligence, and we saw, the signs of the grey wolves again. And I think there is a tremendous history, as you may well be better informed than I, of Turkish intelligence using extremist groups, sometimes creating them to help them against their enemies, generally the Kurds. And now what we're seeing, of course, is the current regime using those old tricks in a way of a more secular time. I think the difference is that they're now doing this on an international stage. And maybe within their own Turkish realm they can control these groups more. It is much harder to control, of course, ISIS or Al-Qaeda if you're playing with them. You know, and maybe they're trying to do what the Qataris and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis have all done. You know, use some of these extremist groups because, one, it stops them attacking you, hopefully, and secondly, it increases your influence in the region. They're not the only ones who've done it. The Brits, of course, were famous for London Stan and having a whole load of different extremist groups based out of London because they thought then they could use them and at least they could get intelligence from them. It's a very dangerous game to play. I mean, certainly I think, you know, thinking back to the beginning of the Arab Spring, the current Turkish Prime Minister, I think it was, who said, we're going to own the Arab Spring. I mean, they certainly saw themselves as being on the side of history, on the tide of history, that it would go, they'll be the new caliphate. I mean, other people want that title as well. But tremendous aggression across the region, often with business. I was at the first big trade fair, construction trade fair in Libya, about a year or so after Gaddafi's fall. Companies from all around the world are about, I don't know, 1,800 firms there. 800 of them were Turkish. Very interesting.
Okay, we're open to questions. I'm going to ask something of the panel, put you on the spot. If we were to get news tonight that Assad was assassinated, who would run Syria tomorrow?
Good luck. I don't think, I mean, Syria right now is just divided into regional. Syria now is in many ways in its actual natural state, right? In the sense that Syria is a series historically of buffer zones, more or less. So you have sort of always the Aleppo area always looking towards Turkey. You had the Damascus, Homs area always looking further south towards Egypt, let's say. The other part was always part of Iraq or whatever, and then the part with Daraa and Suwaid and all, you know, further towards Jordan and so on. And in many respects, I mean, the groups operating in this, you have very few national groups that operate everywhere. I mean, you have some, you know, like Ahrar al-Sham operates pretty much across the board from Idlib down to Daraa. But it's the local people in all of the, Ahrar and all these guys are really Idlib, northern Hama type guys, right? And then you have the Aleppo guys. And so you have pretty much, it's very localized, regionalized now. And I don't think, and each protects their turf very, very strongly. So I don't know if you will have anybody who will run Syria. And this, by the way, goes to the misconception that was earlier on in 2011 that's related to the AKP's posture towards the Muslim Brotherhood. That everybody assumed, well, if Assad falls, the Muslim Brotherhood will rule Syria. You have no idea what the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria is. It betrayed a terrible understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood in Syria is in shambles. Always was in shambles, still is in shambles. Despite Turkish attempts at rehabilitation, they're really not that influential at all on the ground in Syria. Very limited influence, very few militias, and belatedly so. Just also one last thing with regard to Turkey's position in the region. Go back in the early days of the Arab Spring, with the exception of Egypt, the Turkish position actually was very ambiguous about and careful and cautious about change that's going on. And that included in Syria. So they didn't really seize the opportunity to push out Assad. No, they tried to actually rehabilitate the regime and sort of integrate the Muslim Brotherhood that they control within the regime, sort of to add to their leverage in there and sort of position them as an interlocutor with the West more, and with the Iranians more directly. But they didn't actually jump on the bandwagon in Tunisia as well. It's only later, after the dust settled, that they saw the opportunity and pushed forward.
Okay, that's a good answer to tell us who won't run Syria.
I did say nobody's not going to run Syria.
Jamie, what do you think?
Oh, I think there one or two things could happen. I've never looked at the regime as a pure personal dictatorship in the way that maybe Gaddafi in some ways could be argued to have been, or Saddam Hussein. That I think it's more of a junta. And I think that, you know, if Assad was killed tonight, tomorrow, I think there'd be another family member possibly who would take the title. I don't see that the Alawi and some of the Sunni urban middle class have any choice but to fight on because of the consequences if the whole thing collapses. Or it could be the way to open some kind of negotiations with Assad out the way between what's left of the Syrian moderate opposition and the official opposition and what's left of the junta to get some kind of agreement. But then you still got the problem of what do you do with ISIS, what do you do with Jabhat al-Nusra, and a lot of the other Islamist brigades as well, who won't be happy on that kind of negotiation. So, yeah, I'm a reporter. I hate predictions.
Yeah, John, what do you think?
Well, I would actually just say this, that I've been tracking the Arab Spring for the last 4 years, and I would never be so bold as to try to predict anything anymore in this region. I think pretty much anyone who thinks that they know what's going to happen next has been proven wrong time and again and again and again. But actually, just to make one counterpoint to Tony, I mean, we actually have, just looked it up on page 10 in our report, the Turks, they may have been somewhat ambiguous about what they wanted with regard to the Brotherhood, but they did believe that their version of Islamic-infused governance was the model.
Oh, sure.
Without question.
Sure.
You know, and you had people talking about the Turkish model that they wanted to export to the Arab Spring nations, and Davutoglu talked in July 2012 that Turkey would become, quote, the owner, pioneer, and the servant of this new Middle East. And I think that implied the Brotherhood to a certain extent. Now, again, I think you're right about how the Syrian Brotherhood has really been a non-factor probably since Hama, I mean, since the early 1980s. But nevertheless, I think there was an idea in the minds of the Turkish leadership that the Brotherhood was the model on some level, and I think it's important to remember that.
And they weren't the only ones who were pushing that. Some of the Gulf were pushing. I mean, that's been part of the problem with the Syrian opposition.
Of course.
That you've had a
Qataris
political
as well.
opposition outside, you know, Muslim Brotherhood dominated, completely cut off from the actual fighters on the ground.
It's not so much a model, it's the asset that they knew and that they had worked with. So they just took it and wrote it, because otherwise there was nothing else.
I wanted to ask Merve about how the Turkish people feel about this Muslim Brotherhood model as opposed to the old Ataturk model.
Well, we have deep polarization in Turkey, as I'm sure you've read around. So I can't say the Turkish people think one thing about it. I know that the AKP supporters are very much in support of the model that the AKP poses to the Middle East with the Muslim Brotherhood, as we talked about. But there is also a strong opposition which sees how the AKP's model of this post-Islamism, Islam going with democracy, liberal, pluralist worldview, etc., has many, I mean, part of the Turkish opposition would say that it has failed in Turkey, so how could we expect it to succeed in the Middle East? And I think that is a valid question.
Great. We welcome questions. I'll ask one more that's sort of a tough one. Bottom line, can the U.S. degrade and defeat Islamic State without Turkey's cooperation?
I would say no. I think it's impossible. I think that Tony is correct in his assessment. I mean, I think it's by now a fact that the origins of the Islamic State are from some of the Al-Qaeda remnants in Iraq, and we continue to hear about Ba'athists for the former Saddam generals that are behind part of this as well. But I don't believe that the phenomenon would have grown to where it is today without this weapons pipeline, without this human trafficking pipeline, where we now have, I mean, I think it's what, 36,000 foreign fighters that have streamed across the border, and most of them have, it could be lower, it could be more. I mean, we have really no, it's not like they're settling up at the end of every year with an accountant. But you know, we do have a sense, though, that almost all of them are coming across the Turkish border. That almost all of them, I mean, we continue to hear, we talk about this in the report as well, that there are Gulf sheikhs and representatives of the Gulf countries that are sitting across the border in southeastern Turkey, and they're waiting in hotels, and the jihadists come over across the border, they go to the hotel rooms, they show them a video of an attack that they carried out on their phone, and at which point they are rewarded with more cash to go back in and fight again against the Assad regime or against the Kurds or whomever they're fighting. This is something that cannot continue if we are to, I mean, we talk about degrading you know, ISIS. A lot of critique has been that if we don't have boots on the ground to paint targets, then we're never going to be successful. Without locking down that 565-mile border, without preventing the weapons, the cash, the people from going through, that's how you beat ISIS, in my opinion. You cut off their main logistical lifeline. It won't be the end of the war, but you would have a significantly weakened ISIS as a result.
Yeah, it's a logistical base, and if you cut that out, it's where the money comes through, it's where the fighters come through, it's where the supplies come through. If you cut that off, then you do them tremendous harm, more harm than just bombing, actually. But they also can't degrade and ultimately defeat them until they have a third force, proxy force, whatever, on the ground in Syria as well.
That includes, by the way, Iraqi Sunnis. Why haven't Iraqi Sunnis joined the fight in mass against ISIS?
Because they think they're the winning side at the moment.
No, well, not just that. There was a quote in a David Ignatius piece recently, but it's one that you hear often from various Iraqi Sunni figures. It's that if my choice is ISIS or Qasem Soleimani ruling Iran, I'm going to go with ISIS. So again, yes, without question, logistics and all that will degrade and choke off ISIS. But the ISIS phenomenon is not, that's not the sort of the driving engine for it. The driving engine is precisely what this statement from the Iraqi Sunni tribal sheikhs and others, what it explains about what the fundamental dynamic is.
All right, well, I think that'll be the last statement for our panel. Thank you very much. I recommend you, if you haven't already, to read the report. It's very comprehensive and it's very authoritative. And there's a lot of issues that there's still more to go. So thank you again for joining us this morning.